It's like melted candy in your mouth. Welcome to another episode of Erik Whiskey Studies, and in this video I'm going to do a review of the Glenfiddich Fire and Cane. This is batch number 4, which is made from 100% malted barley, a marriage of peated and unpeated malts. It's aged in ex-bourbon and ex-rum casks, bottled at 43% alcohol by volume, and sells for about $57 in my neighborhood. So, if you've been watching me for a while, you've probably heard me say many times, you don't judge a whiskey by a neck pour. This whiskey is kind of strange, not in terms of its aromas and flavors, but in terms of its behavior. When I first poured it from the neck, it was like really muted. Wasn't getting anything out of it, and I was just like, wow, it almost seems without any aromas and flavors. So I put the cork back in it, put it back on the shelf. A few weeks later, pull back out, and all of a sudden, boom, I got an explosion of flavor. It was almost like taking a seized candy from the little paper cups, and rather than biting into the seized candy, take the seized candy, put it into your mouth, and just let it sort of melt and get this gooey, sweet chocolate, caramel flavors in your mouth, right? Without a whole lot of development or complexity or layers, it's just a mouthful of chocolatey, sweet goodness, right? And I was like, oh wow, it's really opened up. Really cool. Delicious. Not a whole lot of complexity, not a whole lot of layers, not a lot of development. It was just a mouthful of melted chocolate goodness, right? And I liked it, even though it wasn't all that complex, all that layered or anything like that. And then it had like this kind of like slight sort of whiff of smoke going on there. Now, you can see, I've done a little bit of work on this thing, got it down behind the shoulder. It's almost like it's gone back into that muted stage. There's not a whole lot there on the nose. It's like when I originally did a neck pour. There's something a little bit there, but it's not, it's just kind of very quiet. And it's really unusual to do something to go muted to sort of exploding with aromas and flavors and then go back to muted again. I've never had this before. Still trying to figure this one out, but let's get on with it. What I do get is very subtle chocolate, very subtle peated notes, very subtle caramels, sort of the center of a candy bar, maybe a little bit of nougat, maybe a little bit of peach, maybe a little bit of apple on the palate. It's showing up a lot more than on the nose. And now there actually is more evolution to it. It's sweet up front and sweet all the way through to the mid palate into the finish. But up front, it's just like I said before, it's like taking a seized candy. If you don't have seized where you're at, just picture a box of chocolates, right? So with some sort of different kind of center in the center of the chocolate, and you take it out of a little paper cup, put it in your mouth, and just let it melt in your mouth. Still getting that effect. Chocolates, caramels, a little bit of smoke, maybe a hint of nuttiness, and that sort of rich goodness. And then the smoke comes up more as sort of a delayed reaction. It's almost like an afterthought that shows up on the back end. Now honey shows up, caramel. It's actually now drying out just a little. It's going from super sweet to actually a little bit of dry on the back end, a little bit of nuttiness, and a little bit of spice. It's almost like it's a completely different whiskey from the neck pour, from the shoulder, and then down a little bit. It's really developing a lot. Almost confusing. It's just really strange. I've watched a number of different other whiskey tubers review this and a number of different reactions to it. The reactions to this whiskey have been sort of all over the map. If I were to put a cover on this, I know if I were to put a cover on this, come back an hour later and try this again, something completely different gonna be there. So here's another way to drink this whiskey. So rather than from a Glencairn, a normal Glencairn, get a larger glass. This is a larger sort of Glencairn, the Canadian Glencairn. This one's actually from the Highland Park Distillery. This is another approach I've tried with whiskeys. I've mentioned it once before in a previous video, but it's not something I do a lot. And what I'm actually going to do is put a large quantity in my mouth and let it sort of soak in my mouth. Almost sort of like, rather than taking a little bite of a little piece of a candy out of a box of See's candies, you put the entire candy in your mouth and you let it melt. So what I just did is, I sped the video up because you don't want to be sitting there staring at me. I actually held it in my mouth for a while, and then I did a countdown of 5 in which I very incrementally, in little bits, swallowed it, and swallowed it. This whiskey actually has a nice viscosity. It's almost like a oily, syrupy sort of texture to it. And that sort of adds to the experience of being like a candy that you let sit in your mouth and melt in your mouth. And you enjoy the flavors that way rather than biting into the candy and chewing it. That's sort of what I'm doing with this whiskey. And I find it, this sounds funny, I actually really like it. I really like it. It's very, very sweet. I would treat this almost as an after dinner whiskey, something to, maybe you've had something spicy for dinner, and you want something really sweet. And so in the place of ice cream or cake or some sort of other kind of dessert or candy, you have this whiskey. It's not super complex. It's not super layered. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of depth, but it's got a nice viscosity to it that it hangs around. And it has this, I like the mouthfeel on this whiskey, and I like the sweetness of it. So what it doesn't have in layers of complexity or development, it sort of makes up for it in sort of a hedonistic lusciousness, right? An extreme sweetness and richness in terms of its mouthfeel. I like this whiskey. It's very, very, very different. If you were tasting it blind, would you think, hey, this is peated? Maybe. The peat really comes across as more of a chocolate character than anything super smoky or anything like that in a typical peated whiskey. Again, it's made from peated malt and unpeated malt, so it's not right up in your face. So what would I give in terms of a score, and would I recommend it to everybody? It's really going to depend on you. I think this is a special occasion whiskey in which you want something super, super sweet that is just sort of that doesn't require any water, you don't have to mess with it, don't put any ice on it, just as is, ready to go. Something that is sort of over the top sweet, dessert-like, and will give you that sort of viscous mouthfeel. Like some chocolates, there's a cherry or something inside, and then there's a sweet syrupy stuff on the inside and the filling inside the chocolate. This would go really, really good. Instead of, if you take a hypodermic needle and take a chocolate and inject it into a chocolate, right? And to fill your chocolates with this, it would work out really, really, really well. In fact, I'm willing to bet this would be an awesome pairing of a whiskey to go with chocolates because it has that profile to it. So, what do we give in terms of score? It's $57. I don't think I'd want to pay $57. I don't think it's a $57 whiskey. I think it's more of a $45 to $50 whiskey, because there's too many other whiskeys out there of similar quality or better quality for this price, or maybe in a little bit lower, and yet it has its place. I know it sounds like I'm dancing around and trying to rate this whiskey. I'm enjoying it, and yet I also know, technically speaking, in terms of how I typically judge a whiskey, layers of complexity, breadth, and depth, right? And the quantity of flavors and aromas, and that it's not ticking the marks. That's how I normally rate a whiskey. And yet, from a completely hedonistic, sweet tooth approach to it, and yet I like it. That's kind of where this whiskey is. So when we give it to a score, You know, I'm going to give it a solid 87 points. A solid 87 points. Is it worth $57? I'd like it to see it come down about at least 10 bucks. I'd like to see it come down about 10 bucks. It's an experimental bottle. Don't expect to see this around again, but I'm still seeing it on the shelves. This actually was originally released like a couple years ago. So forget the score. Forget the score I just gave you. If that sounds like the kind of whiskey you would enjoy, then buy it. If you're looking something maybe a little bit more introductory to peat, because this is very, very introductory. It's barely there, barely noticeable, to sort of get your toes wet. This has that kind of a play. If you know people who aren't necessarily whiskey lovers and you just want to introduce them to something, and this is sort of a very, very super sweet, hedonistic approach to a Scotch, I think they would like this. If you want to give it as a gift, because it is a very pretty bottle, it's got that triangular shape to it, nice colors to it. I think it's very, very presentable. So that's my basic take on it. Would this make my, top 10 out of 20 Highland Peated single malt Scotch whiskeys? No. But that is how I'm going to call it. I think it's worth 87 points. I wish it'd come down 10 bucks. And if I'm in the mood for something sweet, rather than grabbing a piece of candy, I'm probably going to pour myself a little bit of this. Alrighty. If you like watching my videos, but you've not yet subscribed, I'd ask you to subscribe. Ring the bell to be notified when I go live or post a new video. And if you are one of my Patreons, I want to thank you very much. This is a glass I want to drink out of like this. Not this, rather than a fluted glass. Something a little more narrow. I want something that's going to, just sort of sit in my hand. That's how it's going to go. All right. Until next time, cheers.